Back in the day, who would have ever thought that saying hello to us Orientals in Chinese, Japanese, whatever needs, would become such a contentious issue? But here we are in 2024, and a TikTok I posted back in April 2023, which garnered millions of views, is still getting comments daily. In that video, I shared my views on a Filipino girl having a total meltdown when a white man says konnichiwa to her, thereby mis-Asianing her because she's not Japanese. I don't know how anybody could be so upset over being mistaken for Japanese. Like, what's wrong with Japanese? And my view was that I could never be offended by anybody saying hello to me in any language, whether that's Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, Swahili. And I received thousands of hate messages from people who thought I was gaslighting them because I didn't find it offensive. And as a result, I made a further few videos responding to some of these messages. And then I put the whole matter behind me. Then today, I saw this TikTok in my feed, which made me want to jump straight back into the debate.
I have to give it up to the Asians who live in Europe, the European Asians, because if I'm being honest with you, if I grew up in Europe, I probably would have some pretty severe self-esteem issues. And to see so many of you thriving and making it work is really a testament to your resilience.
Thank you, Chris. That's well observed, because growing up in the UK has made me a very resilient person. And before I continue, I would just like to acknowledge that Chris is a very intelligent creator whose content often brings me laughter as well as food for thought. And just to clarify for my UK audience, when Chris says Asian, he means East Asian or Oriental, as opposed to South Asian, which is usually implied by the word Asian here in the UK. But back to the point I was making, that Chris is correct that us BBCs, British born Chinese or British raised Chinese, are very resilient, having grown up here in this country, especially those in my generation, Generation X. The racism I faced in the 70s and 80s was intense, and we all suffered that. People of any identity group, whether you were Indian, Pakistani, Eastern European, ginger, anything, we all got really badly bullied for whatever characteristic made us stand out, which in my case was my Chinesiness. And sometimes it was aggressive and hateful and meant to hurt. But other times it was just casual roasting, and we all roasted one another back in the day. But you could easily differentiate when a pack of strangers would yell at me from across the street to go back to China. That was painful. But when I got a bit older and the local hoods would greet me, "Yo, China," and I replied, "Sup, nigga," it was cool. Yeah, we were very relaxed about language back in the day here in the UK. And when I spent time in LA in the 90s, it was the same there. So you could call it resilience, as you did, but you could say that's just how we rolled. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, was the old saying. Especially when the most vile words were often uttered by our best friends as they were roasting us. And having spent time in Italy too, I would say the Italians are probably perhaps even more crude than the British. I would put them up there with the Cantonese, in fact. Yeah, we have a lot in common, Italians and Cantonese, if we think it worth saying it.
But the very first night that I landed in London, I was roaming around the streets of Soho looking for something to eat, and some guy bikes past me yelling, "Ni hao, ni hao!" And I was like, oh, okay, maybe I just got really unlucky. But then the same thing happened to me in Copenhagen. And then the same thing happened to me again in Amsterdam. And at that point, I was like, there is no way all of this is just a coincidence.
Correct. This is not a coincidence. This happens all over Europe. And I would say probably much more so on the continent, because no one has said konnichiwa or ni hao to me here in the UK for at least a decade. But I think that might be because I don't look as Chinese now as I did when I was younger, because I don't have that rice bowl haircut anymore. When I did, I looked very Chinese. But now, my look is more like Shaolin monk, and people don't really associate that with Chinese. Perhaps if I had more of a K-pop kind of hairdo, I'd get more ni haos and konnichiwas.
When you travel the world enough, you learn to develop thick skin to this kind of stuff and kind of, learn to be unfazed by them. But it was particularly shocking to me to experience these kind of overt forms of racism in Europe.
I think you would have to come from Canada to consider ni hao an overt form of racism. Because overt racism here, for me, was, as I said earlier on, when people yelled at me from across the street to F off back to China. Or when I'd be walking down the hallway at school and a whole group of boys would crowd around me, pulling eyes, pointing at me, laughing, jeering, some of them putting their hands in a prayer position, saying, Ching Chong Chinaman, arsehole, and all kinds of other crazy things. But when strangers said ni hao to me, I could never take offense because by comparison, it was such a lovely thing to hear. Hello in my language, even though it wasn't strictly my language, but I often corrected them and told them it's ne hao ma in Cantonese. And it usually led to an interesting conversation about Hong Kong. And they often turned out to be genuinely interested in my background. And that's why they said ni hao to me instead of Ching Chong Chinaman. This is something that a lot of North Americans find really hard to grasp because it's so different from their experience in North America. But a lot of Europeans get a real kick out of trying to say hello to you in your language or what they think is your language. And a lot of them have a real fascination with Asia. So when they see one of us in Europe, they try to connect with us by saying ni hao or konnichiwa or sawadi, especially among Gen Xers. A lot of the younger generations have a very strong sense of stranger danger, but that was not a thing in my time. In the 80s, it was quite customary to be sat on a train and chat to all the strangers sitting around you and get to know them by the time you reach your destination. This used to be a very hospitable country, and for a lot of people in Gen X, it still is. So this accounted for a lot of the people who said ni hao to me over the years. There are some weirdos out there who are trying to mock you, but when somebody yells ni hao at me from a bicycle, I have no way of determining what their intention is in that split second. And I really wouldn't be inclined to give it any further thought. I don't know them, and I probably will never see them again. But it's definitely not in my nature to assume the worst and imagine that they had negative intentions. Perhaps because my self-esteem is so high, because I grew up with such resilience in this country.
And so if you look like me and you come here, you might experience the same thing. I get a bunch of people trying to gaslight me into believing that it's not racism.
So hopefully my expressing a different opinion on this is not considered gaslighting to anybody. I have no intention of denying anybody else's experience because the way everybody perceives their world is shaped by their own set of unique personal experiences. And my experience as a British Chinese Gen Xer is obviously totally different from that of a Canadian Chinese millennial or any other person. So what somebody else perceives as racism isn't the same as what I perceive as racism. And in a diverse world, we have to allow for diversity of thought.